this land too bad, boy. I believe in land. I believe in land.
Hi, I'm Michael Mulida, Director of Green Hills by the River and a graduate of UWI.Film program. So check us out.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the UWI.Film program's live stream of our workshop series, Filming TNT. This morning, we are going to be having our third installment of this workshop. This one is specifically about story and storytelling. It's entitled A Story is a Machine, and it's going to be hosted by Miss Amanda Zilla, a PhD candidate for Literatures in English at the University of the West Indies. So we thank you all for tuning in, and this particular workshop is incredibly important, especially for us at the program, because after almost 20 years in existence and looking at the development of film and in the Caribbean, especially Trinidad and Tobago, we have been told time and time again, while we are improving on the technical aspects, we have, incredible cameras, getting amazing shots, development, composition. We are working on the audio. Audio is getting much better. But one of the things that we are really lacking with, and we do need improvement and a lot more attention to, is this idea of story and storycraft. We all know that when we look at a local film, we see the people we know in terms of actors, we hear the music we love, it looks visually appealing, however, the story is just not there. And in a world where there's so many films to choose from so many different regions that are and have mastered the art of storytelling, this is something that we need to focus on. Because ultimately, it's not really a condemnation on people from Trinidad and Tobago. We are natural storytellers in the Caribbean. However, translating and adapting that story to screen is ultimately where we need a lot of attention and work. So today we're going to focus specifically on the art of storytelling, even before the story makes it to the screen. So thank you again for joining us within this workshop, and I hope you guys enjoy and learn a lot today. And without further ado, we have Miss Amanda Zilla.
Hi, so good morning, everyone. So today we'll be trying to basically decode this statement, a story is a machine, so that we're able to work conceptually on stories from the point of idea all the way to the manifestation of that final screenplay where you have all your events and plots and everything well structured and just ready to be performed. So the first thing we're going to look at is, why are we saying a story is like a machine? Well, very much like a machine, a story is made up of several parts that work together that allow it to function. And when we talk about function with respect to storytelling, it refers to its ability to convey this particular theme or message, because that is essentially what all stories, be they filmic, textual, narrative, or on any mediated platform, that is essentially its objective, to convey a particular message, to comment on a particular aspect of the human condition, or to simply tell stories about characters that we have envisioned and created. So the second thing we need to pay attention to that is a shared similarity is that different parts have different levels of importance. So when we think about a story, we can't have a story without the major things like character, setting, plot. You can't have a story without a plot, right? And the third thing is that sometimes if there's an issue in one area, it compromises the entire functionality of your story. So while I have separated today's presentation into these singular topics like character and plot and setting. What I really want us to look at too is how they're all interdependent on each other and they need to be working in tandem smoothly. And to further expand on that idea of smooth operation, for there to be a smooth mode of operationality for the machine, it has to be effective, right? All the parts need to be working and we need to have a clear idea of what we want the machine to do. So naturally, the first thing we need to work out is, what do we want that machine to do? What do we want our story to tell? So far, I've included like 3 questions here, right? You want to determine what is the overall message that you're trying to convey to your intended audience. You want to determine what this message is conveying about the nature of emotions, circumstances, the human condition, and what aspects of life or the human condition do you want to reflect in your film? And what commentary do you want to make on these elements? Because even if your film is, let's say it's a fictional film with characters that you have developed and conceptualized and all of these things, your voice is still there to some extent, creating some kind of latent commentary on the aspects of life that the characters are mimetically representing. So I personally believe that a good place to start with in terms of conceptualizing story for film is this aspect of theme. Because once you know what are the big things you want to talk about, it's easy to put together and assemble the rest of the machine to make that work. So I think one good filmic example of this part of the process being important was in that recent biopic of Jonathan Larson, Tick, Tick, Boom, when he was trying to decipher what is the next musical he's going to write. And they show him on the floor with all these little pieces of paper around him. And what he doesn't have is character or any of those things. He has words like love and the meaning of life and time and all of these things. So I think that's a good visual representation in film too of process. You want to start with these big things and work backward. So these are the major parts of our machine when we think of story as a machine. We have character that is related to narrative perspective, plot, context, and then context related to setting and conflict. And what we see from this diagram is that it's totally enclosed and it's all interdependent on each other. Well, we might look at these things as being discrete elements of a story. When we think about how they're interconnected, there's no room outside of it to say any one element is existing in isolation away from the others. So while the bubbles that are not light purple represent these like narratological concepts, the light purple bubbles with the visual and auditory cinematography strategies is where your skill and craft and artistic vision is going to meet these concepts. So before I go into these things as independent topics, this is the big question that I want you to keep in your mind, because you all would have your own story concepts and that kind of thing that you're probably working on. So how is each of these narrative choices with respect to setting, character, plot, how is all of this going to assist you in conveying your intended message to the intended audience in the way that you want? Because we know that there can be tons of films on the same things. Take, for instance, big issues like love and political instability. We have tons of film already that exist on these things. But each one of them brings something different or a different angle to it. So that is what we mean there when we say in the way that you wish. What part of this big concept are you personally trying to convey? So the first thing we want to look at is plots. So from a literary perspective, we would define plots in a dramatic or narrative work as being constituted by its events and actions, as these are rendered and ordered toward achieving particular artistic and emotional effects. And that's what you all would probably call aesthetics, right, of the film, yeah? And the description is deceptively simple, because the actions, including verbal discourse as well as physical actions, are performed by particular characters. So already we see the interdependence between character and plot in a work and are the means by which they exhibit their moral and dispositional qualities. So plot and character are therefore interdependent, critical concepts. As Henry James has said, what is character but the determination of incident? What is incident but the illustration of character? So here we have a little formula for narrative structure. They're saying that story, which is the action, and plot has to do with the arrangement. So story might be chronologically arranged, but again, for plot, you might want to reorder it in a particular way to achieve a particular effect. So you might want to reorder it to include a flashback at a point where you believe that information from the past is critical to what is unfolding in the present and that kind of thing. So there you see it as two different discrete things, even though sometimes we use the terms interchangeably. And when we combine both of those aspects, that's where we get narrative structure. So the plot is more concerned with arrangement, but story is concerned with that conceptual thing that you're trying to convey, what is going to happen next, that kind of thing. The events are story, but the arrangement is plot. Yeah. I'm sorry for this graphic. It was the only one I could find that really captured what I was trying to say. But yeah, so this is one of the first major decisions you need to do. So we're talking about the point where you just have an idea, you haven't started to write a screenplay as yet, right? What type of story am I telling? Am I telling a story that is driven by plot, in which the logic and causality of events are working together to produce a story? Or am I telling a story that is character-driven? And this applies not only, especially the character-driven, not only to fictional film, but also to documentary film, right? You might want to center some kind of documentary on a single figure. And it's still storytelling, even though it's non-fictional. Because the same elements that make fictional storytelling compelling also exist in non-fictional storytelling, especially where film is concerned. Right, so we know, we probably said it a million times in the last 5 minutes, plot is related to structure. So these are some of the things we need to consider, right? So is character or the situations or events of the story more important or more effective to conveying the intended meaning of the film? So that again is guiding you towards deciding what kind of story am I telling? And then we know that this has been like the major technique in a lot of the content on these streaming platforms now, these sharp twists at the end and the cliffhangers to get us to log in again. But even though it's popular, we need to ask ourselves, is this really going to enhance my film in any way? Or am I just doing it for, you know, that little shock value? Do I want my climax to occur in the middle or at the end of the film? And this is important too because it changes the entire plot structure, as you will see on the next slide. And if so, how is this contributing to the audience's meaning-making process? So films that tend to climax at the end usually involve things like the unreliable narrator, where the entire time you think something else is going on, but again, at the end, right before the resolution, there's a reason why it's climaxing at that point. Again, to facilitate the idea that the narrator is unreliable. So we see how a lot of techniques are tied directly to structure as well. So there are lots of different plot structures at your disposal, and I've just chosen a few. So the bottom, this is my right hand, the bottom right has what I would have just described, climaxing towards the end of the film, sudden resolution. This here is a more linear, symmetrical plot structure. Your climax is in the middle, and then the rest of the film is spent trying to work out whatever problem has arisen at that point, and we know we cannot have a story without conflict of some kind. Because what is moving your story forward, if not conflict? The hero's journey is one of the more traditional ones that we've probably seen in a lot of fantasy as well, like Lord of the Rings and that kind of thing. Narratives in the Bible are also kind of like the hero's journey story as well in the New Testament. And the one on the top right, I brought that to your attention because that is one that the storytellers involved in the production of a particular television series. Have you all heard of Dan Harmon? Have you all seen Community? That's it. Yeah. So he developed his own plot structure that he used. So a lot of times familiarizing yourself with what is out there can be generative towards your own innovation of something that works for you. Because a lot of times we might have all these existing things, but none of it is directly helping you to tell the kind of story that you want to tell. So I think that one there is probably the most important one. How can I use what already exists, adapt it, change it, to tell my story in the most effective way possible? Right, so I would have dropped the word causality very casually earlier. But when we talk about causality, it refers to the fact that events occur in distributions. They are linked to each other as cause to effect, effects in turn causing other effects, until the final effect. And even if two events seem not obviously interrelated, we infer that they may be on some larger principle. So this is actually one of the biggest challenges, not just for film, but for creative writing in general. Sometimes we write stories and there are identifiable gaps. And this absence of paying attention to causality sometimes is where these gaps occur. Because your events, like I said, even if they don't seem to be related, they have to be feeding into that overall narrative in some way. Right, so now we move into character. And to continue that metaphor of the story being a machine is the fact that characters are means rather than ends of the story. That means your characters are little cogs that are carrying your story forward. They are catalyzing that efficiency of the machine. So Chapman is telling us that character is reconstructed by the audience from evidence announced or implicit, so directly or indirectly conveyed, in an original construction and communicated by the discourse. So believability and realism with respect to character is actually one of the biggest and most important things when you're telling a particular story. So these are some of the things that we want to consider when we're developing character. Their traits, the uniqueness of this trait, and in many instances we see that in fictional narratives, the names that they have are directly tied to their role in the story, or it might evoke some kind of intertextual link to some other narrative or film or something like that. So with direct characterization, it's where the author describes, so that would be in textual narrative. In film, it would occur if we use overhead narration, right? But in the case of like regular non-narrated film, where it's the characters and their dialogue and speech acts and all of these things that are moving the story forward, you may have to rely on these indirect aspects, such as appearance, speech, thoughts and feelings, which may be the most difficult thing to capture, right? Because if we're on the outside of the actor, how are we capturing what's on the inside, especially if we're not relying on words? So those key shots that you see sometimes in movies where they frame it and you catch that glance that seems out of the situation or the context and you could tell, okay, something is not right there. Those are the kinds of things we have to rely on in film for indirect characterization. So these are the basic kinds of characters, some of whom you probably would have known from a very long time ago since in secondary school. We have the quintessential good guy, right? The protagonist who is carrying the story forward and they meet some opposing force known as the antagonist. And usually our protagonists and antagonists are round characters that have this developed personality and that kind of thing. And then you have these other characters who are just background characters that kind of help move the story along. So I would say they're more static rather than totally flat. Because if they're still impacting the story in some way, then they're not like background characters. So flat characters in film would be like your extras and the people that you're just using to populate the scene, right? Because they have no direct, their traits are not directly affecting the story that you're trying to tell. So even though character is something that we conceptualize, there are existing archetypes and particular genres as well. You would find specific types of characters. So in fantasy, you would always find this idea of the guide, the Dumbledores and the Gandalfs of the film world, yeah? So this is why determining what kind of story you want to tell up front is also very important. Because then you can begin to fashion exactly what kind of qualities you want your characters to have. Because those traits need to be believable within the context of the story. And it also needs to influence your characters' motivations for their actions. So in literature, we like to say that the characters are not real people, right? You treat them as an element in the text. But because film, we treat it like a mimetic medium where art is reflecting life, that believability and realism where they seem like real people has to come across, yeah? So that ended up being a lot smaller than I thought it would be. So I'll just read a few for you. So the warrior one, these figures who would obviously be a protagonist figure, right? Because they describe it as someone who's confident, collected, ready for anything. But you could also spin that archetype into a villain or a protagonist by amplifying the weaknesses associated with that archetype. So they have things like being egotistical, underestimating their opponents, overconfidence, all of these things. So for each of these traits where they have these strengths, their weaknesses are able to totally invert their role in the story. And these are just like broad archetypes too, because with the lover, we have archetypes like the forbidden lovers and that kind of thing in different stories. They don't naturally have to fit neatly into these archetypes, but they could feed off of the traits that we see from them. The ruler is also a pretty common one as well, where their strengths are like communication and leadership, and then their weakness is their necessity to control. So we see a lot of that in film and narrative as well, these leadership figures, yeah? So we know that we need a setting in all narratives, be it filmic or otherwise. So when we talk about setting, it's both spatial and temporal. But in film, that's a little complicated too, because set and setting go together. So while you might have a conceptual, spatial, and temporal idea in your mind, you also have to think about how you're going to recreate that space, especially if it's like a historical moment or something that has happened in the past. How are you going to recapture that? So I think if we look at the local film scene too, that's one of Green Days by the River's strength, right? That ability to recapture the era that Michael Anthony wrote about. So when we talk about setting, we can refer to those elements within the frame that depict space, place, and time. And then that brings us to how are we going to reproduce that? Are we going to use an existing locale? Are we going to use a set, a built, constructed set? And either way, again, these are decisions that you need to make up front. So context here is kind of where setting, character, and plot are all going to kind of meet each other now. So when we talk about context, we talk about how in the filmic narrative, whether it's fictional or not, there are particular social, cultural, political, and historical conditions and circumstances which inevitably shape the direction your story is taking. So because of this, it can affect the aesthetics of the film, it can affect your choice in setting, and it can also be a source of conflict for your characters, especially if you're looking at doing something that occurs historically. For example, if you were to create a character during segregation in the US and he's a black character and he's defying, he's rebelling against all the various sources of oppression. In his case, his context is directly related to his personal conflicts. And the same thing can be said for non-fictional narrative, especially if it's a documentary, whether it's focused on person or place, because everything is being shaped by these intangible forces that are occurring around them. The very things that make you want to cover a particular person in a documentary is shaped by the way that their context has affected who they are as people, right? We are all shaped by our environment in some way. And these are the intangible factors that are doing so. So making sure that your film has an established and identifiable context, that identifiable part is important, is to ensure that that realism is captured. So while many films take that non-narrator approach, there are many different narrative perspective things to look at in terms of film. And two areas of it that are associated with point of view arise out of the fact that the medium is both visual and auditory. And we have an opportunity, because of those two channels, to create different points of view within a singular narrative. So these are the three things we're going to look at. So like I said, this one might be the most common one that we've encountered, the non-narrated film. And these films are contrary to character mimesis instead of the diegetic narrator. So the diegetic narrator would be one who is situated within the story world itself and relay the events of the narrative through actions and speech and that kind of thing. There's no one telling you what this person's role is or any of those things. It's up to the audience to decipher from how they are depicted. So it means then that if we're scripting a non-narrated film in our screenplay, we need to account for how every single frame, every single facial reaction, every single exchange between particular characters is going to convey the things that a narrator would have said if we included one. So that ties into that point there, right? For a non-narrated film, characterization and its relationship to plot and causality are of utmost importance. So then too, your dialogue and your exchanges between your characters need to be believable, but it also needs to be directly related to the chain of events that are unfolding. Unless you're doing like a super postmodern, fragmented, kind of Mulholland Drive kind of film structure. Have you all seen Mulholland Drive? Anybody? No? Homework, yeah? So we know about the first person, the second person, and third person narrator. The first person is the I, the second is the you, and the third is he, she, they, right? And to introduce the fancy terms into the discussion now, we have the homodiegetic narrator, who is also one of the characters, and then the heterodiegetic narration, well, that's supposed to be narrator, who does not belong to the set of characters inhabiting the story world. So here we have two choices, and it's up to you to decide whether you want your narrator to be seen as entirely objective because he's removed from the story world, or whether you want somebody who is deeply entrenched. Because conveying events from their perspective is central to the understanding of the story that you want to create. So again, to use a contemporary example, having Amy as the narrator in Gone Girl really shapes the story. Because if we had a narrator who was outside of the story world, it would have given us a more top view of the events rather than her framing how we think about everything that has happened up until a certain point. Yeah. So the unreliable narrator. And like I said, I've been noticing that this is a very popular trend. And I also think it's one of the hardest ones to write in terms of storytelling as well. Because even though we know that there has to be the sharp turn in which it reveals that the narrator is unreliable, creating that key moment and timing it perfectly can be a little bit of a struggle, because you need to ensure that the revelation of the narrator's unreliability is happening at a key moment where that revelation is not going to unravel everything else before in a negative way. That is going to work exactly how you want it to work. So when we define that unreliable narrator, we're referring to one whose perception and interpretation of what he or she narrates does not correspond or coincide with the perceptions, interpretations, and opinions of the author, who is or who purports to be the controlling force in the narration. So in order to effectively convey an unreliable narrator who is a character within your story, close attention to so many different parts of our machine. As we see here, right? There's characterization, that control of the visual channel, holding your attention in one direction because in the other direction, that's where the truth is, right? And then we also have plot structure. So like I said, the key to the unreliable narrator is that moment where you reveal that this person is unreliable. So there are actually 6 different types of unreliable narrators, and each of them kind of guide us away from the fact that it could be unreliable from a viewer standpoint. You, of course, have to have their whole, characterization, everything fully fleshed out. You have to know this person is, their whole objective is to just be unreliable and deceive the audience. Yeah? So a lot of these, especially the innocent, and I find the outsider tend to be the 2 most popular ones. So the innocent is the type of narrator who is naive to the facts of the world. They are unreliable because they are a child or have the mind of a child. The outsider is a character who is shunned by society for cultural, racial, or socioeconomic reasons. They could also be a character who is just new to town. So we see that one, I think, more popularly, where the person is just on the outside, so we take them as unsuspecting because they're new and they're now being entered into this world of the narrative that has existed before their entrance. And then we have the tall teller, who is concerned with telling a good story and will exaggerate events for dramatic effect. But obviously, for that one to work, you have to not know that they're exaggerating. So the way that it has to be conveyed has to seem credible while also seeming fantastic. And when I say fantastic, I mean made up of that fantasy realm, right? Right, so point of view in film. So while point of view in a text and transitions between point of view can be easily established within textual narrative, storytelling in film requires that the storytelling point of view be further subdivided into terms like ocularization and auricularization. So when we read like a novel or something, very casually, without announcing themselves, writers are able to basically shift between different degrees of access to the interiority of characters. It might be told from one character's perspective, but then we kind of get this omniscient viewpoint of something else. And it happens so seamlessly. But with film, if you go to sharply transition from one point of view to another, you are compromising narrativity, right? Unless that sharp transit has a reason or an intentionality behind it. So when we think ocular, we think visual channel. When we think auricular, we think hearing, yeah? So as we can see, narrativity in film is not as simple as just narrator, narratee, audience, that kind of thing. It exists on so many levels. That first level is where you exist as people involved in the creation of film and narrative storytelling through this medium. And then you have to kind of navigate this maze of the other 7 to get to that spectator or audience. But I want to zero in on that idea of the implied spectator. When you're writing your screenplay, conceptualizing your story, without realizing it, you already have in your mind an expectation of what the audience will interpret from what you have produced. That is your intended or implied spectator. It's not a real person, but it's a concept. In the same way, that implied spectator has their own expectation of you as a director, producer, creator, somebody who has built this narrative from the ground up. They have their ideas about you, where this story is coming from, all of these things. Now, all these levels in the middle, that's what we're going to be looking at in the next few slides, because it's up to you to decide which level would be best to help you to convey your narrative. So when we think zero ocularization, we think the nobody shots, right? It's not exactly focused anywhere, so it's like third person then, right? But the internal ocularization, you have a focalizer for your film, you have your main character who you want the focus to remain on, and that is when you would use your internal ocularization. So Nick Brown defines this zero ocularization as when the camera is showing the character from the outside and does not count as a diegetic agent within a fictional world. So we said this idea of the diegetic refers to within the story. So it means too that point of view, in addition to your story having a point of view, you are creating a whole other point of view with the types of shots that you are using, that you're creating then with the camera, yeah? So then essentially it's 3 points of views you have in total. The ones with the camera, the ones that you use the auditory channel to create, and then the one that the story itself possesses. So you need to make sure that at every level of writing the story, each one is given its justice, basically. Right, so internal ocularization refers to subjective images which can be ascribed to a diegetic agent. Right, we said that already. But here we see how it's being tied to technique. The use of montage, lap dissolves, fade over, color fade, slow motion. And when they say the distortion of sound, we now see that connection in the diagram at the beginning with the components of the machine. There was a double-ended arrow between the audio and the visual. The fact that they're telling us that that distortion of sound can be used for visual point of view is showing us that connection between the two things. It's establishing it. And they refer to music and other devices. So although ocularization can be defined in purely technical terms, when looking at the specific semiotic narrative, so semiotics refers to that idea of we see something and it evokes a particular thing for us, right? So you see a stop sign and you know you have to stop, or if you're looking at a movie or a play and you see a particular color being used, you might associate the color with particular implications. Things like that refer to semiotic signs and what they represent for us. Right, so we can only classify it in its interplay with focalization. So again, all of these things, these choices that we may use, even in terms of like symbolism and that kind of thing, it's all tied towards a particular interpretation and a particular point of view. And here now we see where it extends into the concept of character. So thus, a segment of what a character remembers is not tied to internal ocularization. Instead, conventional flashback structure first shows the character in zero ocularization and only then slides into this character's visualized flashback, which itself is mediated in zero ocularization. So to decode that very complicated sentence, all it's saying is that when you switch into flashback, the character themselves isn't narrating that flashback to you unless you use overhead narration. Again, it's the camera showing you these events from the past from a third-person perspective. So then this concept of memory becomes a psychological and spatial plane within the character. Yeah? But you are situating the flashback from a third-person point of view on that plane. Yeah, we good so far, everybody? Right, so again, the zero auricularization has a similar definition then to the zero ocularization, but here it's ascribed to sound. So the sound cannot be ascribed to a shown agent. So sometimes as a way of shielding particular action from happening, it happens off this outside of the frame then of the shot, but the sound is there, but you can't attribute to where the sound is coming from. It's not coming from speech. It's not coming from any visible source. That's what they're talking about. So it can be on screen as well, but again, the source is not obvious, yeah? It's not coming directly from a character, so to speak. So internal auricularization consists of auditory subjectivity. So the soundtrack mediates what the character is hearing in the shown world, and it must therefore be located on the intradiegetic levels, or those below, just like the enounced of the subjective camera. So we talked about earlier how one of the challenges with film and this representation of character is bringing the interior to the exterior. And a lot of times that is what all of these elements in film are working together to do, to help you to represent the subjectivity of any of the characters that you have created. Sound is also doing that. So when we talk about this idea of the intradiegetic levels and these kinds of things, and the use of scoring and soundtrack, it's to amplify these interior intangible things that we cannot represent through our knowledge and the availability of the technical aspects. So what we've been seeing so far with these discussions of the two different ways that we could further subdivide point of view is that you have to marry the technical with the creative in the storytelling, yeah? So it's a fine balance between everything you know about film as well as all of these inherently narratology associated elements. Has anybody seen this diagram before? No? Okay, so this is taken from a book called Narrative in Fiction and Film, an Introduction by Jacob Loeth. And here he shows exactly how this idea of the auditory and the visual can be broken down into these technical aspects. So again, with the auditory channel, he starts with what type of sound is it? Is it background noise? Is it music? Is it the voice of a character? And then now you need to decide, is this happening on screen or is it off screen, commentative in the sense of overhead narration, that kind of thing? Or is it within earshot of the characters? And is there a reason why they cannot see what is taking place? And then we have the visual channel, which breaks down into a lot more than the auditory. So the nature of the image, right? Where are you placing your actors? Where are you setting your story? What props are you using to achieve the aesthetic, the context, all of these things, that sense of realism. So in the same sense that this nice little tape box has been drawn for me here, you might want to place marks for a particular reason because you want the elements of your scene, be they character elements or elements of the set, to look a particular way within the shot. Because in a sense, too, your camera is your pen. On one side, you have written this story with plot and narrative, but you're also writing a second story now with how you are directing the shots. Are you showing someone from their side profile? Is it a silhouette? What am I showing and shielding the audience from? And again, the big question, right? How is this helping me to tell a particular story in the way that I want to tell it? Right, and then when we go to actor, we have appearance and performance. So we know that sometimes in casting, we might have a particular look that we might be looking for a character. That's what they're referring to. Or in this age where movie makeup has come so far, we could transform anybody into anything, yeah? And then the performance. What sense of emotional gravitas is that actor able to embody and to deliver to the film? And is that actor able to capture the kind of emotion, the kind of subjective representation that you want or need for your story? Right, so then we come down again to more of the technicality, things like the editing, type and rhythm. We'll go further into that when we talk about ordering and duration and all of that. And then we have the actual cinematography, things like lighting, color, camera angles, mise en scène. And all of these things are, again, inherently related to good storytelling. Lighting and color, like we said, could be used symbolically. Shadows can be used, again, to hide particular things that might be too graphic for an audience. So I think a recent really good example of that was in Blonde. You also Blonde as yet? No? I feel like I keep using examples and nobody has seen that. Yeah, so in Blonde, when they're depicting things like domestic violence, happens off screen. Because you don't put, again, they're fulfilling a kind of ethical obligation to their audience, right? So again, it's telling a story how I want it to be told and how, well, not rather how, but what message I want to be taken out of this story by the audience. What do I want my implied spectator to understand? Okay, so yeah, we talked about camera angles, distance, movement, all of that. And now we move on to, again, these temporal aspects. So when we talk about order, they say that the order of a narrative with respect to discourse can rearrange itself as much as it pleases. There is no need for it to be chronological. But the story must remain discernible. You can rearrange the events as much as you want, but at the end, your spectator should know what the story is. So we know there are lots of films that use that kind of fragmented approach, but in the end, the audience is still able to take away some kind of holistic understanding. So it means with ordering, and we talked about plot being related to structure, so ordering feeds directly into that. And the order of narrative events can be chronologically reordered using flashbacks and flash forwards, yeah? So that is at the simplest level, right? You include a flashback where you think the information from the past is important. You include a flash forward where you want to kind of create some ellipsis over a period of time, that kind of thing. And then you have order like this. I'm going to ask this question. I feel like people are going to say no again. Has anybody seen Cloud Atlas 2012? Yes, I got one yes. But the structure of the story is circular. So when you think chronology in your own thing, doesn't mean it has to be a straight line. We dip here for a flashback, we come back up, we come here. No. You could also get a little more creative with this. Now again, ordering has to have intentionality behind it. So this story takes place across 6 different time periods, 6 different spatial locations. So it starts off in the 17th century, I believe, during slavery in the Pacific, and it moves all the way from the top of the circle. This is just going to make me look so short. And when we end up here, it's like a post-apocalyptic society. So it really spans hundreds of years. Now, if you look at the circle, they're parallel, right? The same, like, there's 6 different sections, right? So the same section is occurring parallel to each other in the circle. Again, that is not accidental. That is not we woke up one day and we were like, let's make this story in a circle instead of a straight line. And the reason for it here now is because this is an adaptation of a novel. So throughout the novel, they quoted this philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, and he has this concept of eternal recurrence, where it says that everything that has gone before will come again, and time just keeps cycling over and over, and it's the same people, and we're doing the same thing. Circle. Yeah? So we see how structure is also tied directly to meaning. Because in the movie as well, for each of the 6 sections, even though it's totally different time periods, totally different spaces, they also use the same actors. And they also use symbols and motifs and that kind of thing to allow the audience to make the connection that it's all going round and round and it will keep going that way. So again, don't be afraid to be a little playful too when you're writing your screenplays, but make sure it's intentional playfulness, not playfulness for the sake of, let me just be different with no legitimate reason, right? So when we talk about duration, there's like 2 ways that we define it. Discourse time and the amount of time that we take to read or watch a particular story. So obviously, it's very unlikely in a film, unless it's something like Malcolm and Marie, where 1 minute in the story is equal to 1 minute in real life. You all have seen Malcolm and Marie? No. Yes, that's the one with Zendaya. And it's after they get home and they're just having an argument. That's the whole movie. They argue for a good solid 2 hours with intention, right? So there's kind of almost like I would say a 1-to-1. 1 minute in story time is also 1 minute in the length of time that we're taking to watch it. But then, that's impractical, right? In Cloud Atlas, a minute in the movie is not equal to a minute in the story world, because how are we spanning hundreds and hundreds of years in 3 hours, if that is the case? Thank you. Right. So Seymour Chapman has kind of criticized the ability of film to convey summaries. Because he said all we have at our disposal are things like montage and that kind of thing. And he feels it's not adequate to create summary. But I beg to differ, because in many instances a montage can be effective and help to summarize what takes place across a large chunk of time, because that is not the main incident that's driving the story forward. It's more like feeding into it rather than being a direct relation to events and causality. So we see plot, time, all of these things coming together here. So I would have just, I don't want to say name drop, but term dropped ellipsis a little earlier. So what that means is when we kind of compress time or jump over particular parts, right? So in filmic terms, it might be when we cut between one event and we reopen the next scene, and time has clearly passed the 2, right? So a scene might end in night, and next scene opens in the morning. We just lost about 8 to 9 hours there. That is ellipsis. You have removed that 8 to 9 hours because it's not important to just telling the story you need to tell. So then ellipsis plays an important part in duration in allowing your film within a designated amount of time to really capture what is important and what is central to telling the story you want to tell. It's like with reality TV as well. What we see is not a 1 minute to 1 minute. It's a splicing to create a particular perception of events then. It's the same thing we're doing with fictional narrative. It's the same thing we do with documentary as well, yeah? And then we go on and we have scene. So when we talk about scene, we know the usual components, dialogue, physical action, that kind of thing. But how is that related to duration is that in moments of, I don't want to say suspense, but when you're creating that climax of your story, you could slow the action down a bit in scenes. So in writing, that's what they do too. They might just give you what is important, but in these key scenes that shape the story, they slow time down. So it's almost like when you're writing your screenplay, you have a dial, and it's up to you to determine what is important. What am I speeding over, and what am I slowing down? And that's where stretch comes into. Have you all ever seen, let me just not use a movie and use an example. Have you all ever seen those things where it's like speed up what the person is doing just to kind of get to the next scene? Like somebody's like they have to clean the house or something, and then you just see them speeding through, and then when it's done, time restores its usual pace. It's like that when we talk about stretch. But stretch also refers to slow motion. So again, with film, even though there's that critique that there isn't much you could do in terms of duration, I still feel technique-wise, there is a lot that we can employ. And then we have pause, which, as the name implies, has to do with this idea of pausing action in a particular place in order to like go to other parts of the story and that kind of thing. So basically revealing what is important to a particular time at a particular moment, yeah? Nice. So I have talked a lot in 1 hour. So this is the last point. I'm surprised we got here so fast. Okay, so when we talk about frequency, we're talking about the possible relationship between discourse time and story time. So is something that is happening in your story a single moment? Is it something that is happening multiple times? Is it something that is repetitive? Or is it a single thing that happens at multiple story moments? And each of these is, again, intentional. Have you all seen American Beauty? You're killing me here. So in that movie, they kind of show that everybody is kind of like trapped, right? The adults in that world are trapped by the slowing down of their life when they've reached, middle age and that kind of thing, and they're all just blowing around like a plastic bag in the breeze. Their lives are really slow. They wake up every day, they trim the hedges in the yard. And in that sense, it is repetitive, right? Several repetitions of the same thing in several different places. And it's being done to capture that their lives have kind of slowed to this particular suburban humdrum, and they all want to escape from it, right? So again, even with frequency, how often you repeat particular things, it has to be done with intentionality, right? So like I said, I talked a lot, right? So now I want to see what you all have kind of taken away. So what do you think is central to storytelling in film? Which components do you think would be the most interesting to combine? And then we have questions too. I'm open to that. I did not expect to just zoom through those slides as quickly as I did. This is the equivalent of when you go to lecture and at the end they ask you, what did you learn today? Yeah. It could just be a word that you're going to take away and apply to your own screenwriting. Team, look at that. The best, see, and she said it first, and that's where we said we need to start from. Developing our ideas with the theme, somebody else. Yeah, I hear like people whispering like they're scared that if they, that if they come out, vocalize you all. How many people have a story concept already that they've kind of been playing with in their mind? It doesn't have to be down on paper. Like you're sure,
How do you, okay, so what if you're not good at creating a story? How do you trigger creating a story? Because that might be a problem a lot of people have. I know I'm not good at it, so how do you go about things?
So like with any skill, it takes practice. But if you think you're like really, really bad at it, don't start to work on plot or any of those things first. Start with as small as a paragraph and work through the concept of your story. And then spend the time fleshing it out. Like, you don't have to come up with all your characters in 5 minutes. You know, sit down and think about, create one personality at a time. And then try to figure out, why is this person going to do these things in the story? How are their actions going to impact everybody else? Who are they as well, their identity? Who are they to themselves? Who are they to other people? So it's really just taking the pieces apart and being patient with yourself as well to kind of work through each of the things. Yeah.
Yes, hi. Besides the theme, what stood out to me this morning is the character types.
Yeah.
Because you know in your mind you have an idea of what you want to do, but in terms of developing that character type, because you know when you're watching a movie, you want the character to do what you want to do. So you say, why are you going in the door? Why should you get up and run? Yeah. But when you are telling the story, you can be, so they can figure out so easy. So you have to kind of like put in the character type. So that's one of the things that stood out when I saw all the character types. So I do hope that we get up at the PowerPoint to go with.
Yeah. Yeah, I can make the PowerPoints available
Thanks.
to you all. But I like that example you use of like, why are they going into that door? They're going into that door because they're not a person. They are a cog in the machine, taking the story from point A to point B. And that is why, even though there are critics who like to say that in film characters are independent, I subscribe to that quote that said characters are a means to an end. And that's why. So from a viewer standpoint, it might be infuriating to see these people defy all common sense and go towards danger and all of these things. But it is with a purpose. So I think because we're able to recognize these things from an audience perspective, it's always, like when you're writing, to take yourself totally out of that. While you are writing and you're thinking about your intended audience, you also need to think about what is making my machine, my story work. Any more questions, comments? Were there any terms that were like really new to us and we needed a little recap? Because I was a literature person, I included a lot of like literary terms, so I just want to make sure I interdisciplinarily covered everything and that it's easy to understand. I don't eat people, so you could feel free to ask questions about things like that. So we're all good? We're all ready to write then? We're all ready for workshop time? Yes.
Yeah, I can't remember when it was, but you mentioned something about... Hi. Did this good? All right. She had mentioned something about ethics, like in story, the ethical connection to the audience. How, like, there was a particular example she gave of domestic violence occurring off screen. So that brought to mind, like, I watched The Boys, right? The Amazon series thing. And they're just horrendous with what they show the audience. I want to know, is that a violation of that kind of ethical thing you talked about? Or is that just a different way of telling a story?
I would say it depends on what their intention is. Is that depiction of that graphic violence central to the story that they're telling?
Yeah.
Oh, look, you all had one I didn't see. So, right. Right. So, yeah, in that case, it's the same thing with Game of Thrones, too, right? You take out all the violence and all that, and what are you left with? Some dragons. You know? Yeah. So, when people choose to depict things in certain ways, it is for a certain reason. Some cases, too, especially so like in that case, domestic violence and that kind of thing are really sensitive topics. And oftentimes, victims are usually silenced. Not in the sense that they're silenced by their abuser, but it's not something that they would openly go around telling people. Sometimes by depicting things off screen, you're representing that silencing of them as well. So that's why that idea of intentionality always has to be tied back at each level of the story. You know those like precocious little children where they ask a question and after they ask why all the time? That's what you have to do to yourself when you're writing a story. Like, okay, I want this story to be set here. Why? Yeah? Yeah. Anybody else? So we're all good. We're all ready to conceptualize our stories. Oh, is your camera shy? That's what the problem. Oh, okay. Y'all needed to settle first. But that was the whole point of asking my big question at the end, to see when it starts to settle. What is getting separated into the wheat and the chaff? You know, what are you throwing out and what are you keeping in? Oh, okay. There's a question.
Yeah, I think when you spoke about characterization and development of the plot, I tend to find the biggest issue we have in the Caribbean is because we have such rich stories, the premise is the good part. The conflict, we set it up. We know how we want it to end.
Yeah.
But you see that second act of building to the conflict and then building to the resolution, I think those tend to be the biggest issues. And I guess in terms of what your recommendation would be, because even as a filmmaker, I struggle with that when I work with, that's why I work with screenwriters. And, you know, for everybody, this is why we don't exist in a vacuum where, hey, I'm a filmmaker, so I have to do everything. You have to be able to analyze your strengths and your weaknesses in order to say, hey, I need help.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the characterization and the narration. So I guess in terms of how we begin to build those things in terms of character changes and, or like we like to say in terms of the plot, those low beats where things aren't exactly happening. How do we begin to address these things? Because I know in Caribbean cinema for far too long, well, Caribbean cinema told by Caribbean people, we tend to spend either too much time characterizing and establishing who the people are or trying to build the setup, and then we already like an hour and 15 minutes in, and they were like, crap, we have to conclude this thing or it's going to be too long because we don't have the money. So conflict, boom, movie done. Conflict resolved, movie done. Like, and then you're like, you don't really get time to absorb the actual thing in there. So I guess what would be the tips? What would be the mechanisms that, in terms of the films that you would have observed, how we begin to start addressing these things? And I know when we go offline, we can talk a lot more about these in the workshops, but just in terms of some brief tips or tidbits or observations in terms of how simply we can begin resolving these things.
I think at the simplest level, the attention wouldn't even be on characterization and that kind of thing, but it would actually be on causality. Because if you know where you want to end up, you could start to kind of pull the machine apart. And that's why I like to use that example of the machine. When you pull each of the parts separately and you pull out causality now, you know who your people are, you know where you want them to end up. But now you have to figure out, why are they doing the things they're doing? And the key then would be to kind of try to merge this rising action along with your attempts to depict their subjective representation at the same time. So it might mean that the kind of events you might want to put in the rising action are also events that reveal particular traits about your characters themselves. Yeah, because you're moving from one point to another, but you also don't want to do this kind of reductive representation at the same time. So there your focus would be on who is this personality and how is everything they're doing changing the entire story world. Yeah? And I think as Caribbean people, because we are inherent storytellers, it's harder to work backward. Because when it comes so naturally, I mean, we've all seen it. You sit down, you socialize, and somebody starts to tell a story real dramatically. And it's usually a branching narrative, right? It starts one place, and we branch there, come back, and that complex narrative structure, because branching is a complex narrative structure, is inherent in our communicative makeup as Caribbean people. So now we have to kind of sit down and self-reflect now. What about those stories make them good stories? I think that is where our problem lies. That self-reflexivity. Yeah? I could have put like 20 more slides.
Sorry. That's a good day.
Hi, good day.
So what you're saying is that what we need is more of an ability to observe the society at large and bring that on, to a script first to now adapt to screen?
Maybe not society at large, but the ways that we tell stories specifically. Because telling a story socially and writing a screenplay is not the same thing, right? You tell a story socially, you know what it's going to be about, and it doesn't matter whether you convey the characters in a compelling and realistic way and all of these things. But when you're writing a screenplay now, it's like, I have to provide these kind of cues to whoever is going to perform this as well, as to what type of mindscape they need to be in as well. So that's why I think writing a screenplay is such an activity in working backward instead of just writing something from concept straight. That's why you have to work backward. That's why I said start with what you think you want to talk about and then really sit and flesh each part out individually. Flashcards, I think, would actually be really good. Because that way too, even with plot, even if you don't know what you want to do with plot, you write out the events. Remember, we said story is that chronology and it being told in order. You write out your key moments, spread it out in front of you. Sit on the floor. I do that. I sit on the floor and spread like that. And when you start to move things around, you start to see where particular events might fit better out of chronology as well. Yeah? And it's also to give yourself the room to be creative. Because I think sometimes we're so focused on what the end product, like what we want it to be like, that we kind of put ourselves in a bucket. I wouldn't even say a box. It's a black bucket, and we cannot see outside of the bucket. We need to come out of the bucket a little bit. Be willing to experiment. I mean, I know that filmmaking is a costly endeavor, so you're doing all of this before you start to get your equipment and that kind of thing, right? And really work and flesh these parts out slowly. And I think because of the cost of filmmaking too, I think that's why as Caribbean people, there's an urgency when we get into production to get to the finish line as well, yeah. So there's definitely that concern of the practical, the technical, and the ideal, right? Yeah.
Okay, as you're talking about telling a story as friends of Caribbean people. So again, talking to Caribbean people, so of course they'll understand, like, I hear this now, I went down there. So, at the time that starts, everybody in the story. But how do you translate that onto paper, especially if you're looking at telling the story outside of the Caribbean? How would you, because I think that's what the main thing I have with telling a story. I just think that only Caribbean people are going to see it. So it's something that you think that I don't need to any further context to go back and tell the backstory of it. Yeah. So let's say, come on, folks, is the larger bless. Everyone knows what it is. So you won't need to go back and give any further context. Everybody sees the comfort and they instantly know what it is. But so how do you go and develop that character, especially for people that may not be from the Caribbean to more global audience.
This is just like my brain braining while you were talking.
Yeah.
And the first thing that I thought of is why not, we pass those stories about La Jablas and then folklore, right? That is oral tradition. We tell each other those stories. In very rare instances, it's like textually documented, right? Why not start with some kind of older figure telling a group of children what it is? If that is going to be the focalizer of your narrative, why not give the background at the beginning? So you introduce the character without a sign saying, this is Allah Jablas, defined as. Yeah? Because question.
Do the correct thing. Yeah, just to jump off Jaheem's point, because if you know, well, for one, for everybody in the room who's a student, you all need to watch more films. So that when Amanda comes and says, have you seen X and Y? You have context. So it's important, yes, as students, to ensure that you watch all of your required films for your assignments and the supplemental viewings that your lecturers don't say you have to watch, but you should watch because it's a very large list. So every week that you study, you probably have 3 or 4 films that are on your supplemental viewing list. Hint, hint, that's how you get your A. But also inculcate yourself with watching other films. So when people come and ask you about it, you have some context. You can't see all. But coming back to Jaheem's point, Caribbean tangent. If you look at African filmmaking now, and we're not just looking at Nollywood, because we only look at Nollywood, that same thing that has passed on to the Caribbean from both India and Africa in terms of the concept of the griot and oral tradition. You've seen there was a film we were looking at in this year's Africa Film TT, and it was about how that whole issue of griotism plays a major part in the prison system in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's exactly what Ms. Zilla is saying, how you can now begin to use that storytelling aspect to bring in parts of a narrative and make it a key element versus trying to spend 30 minutes explaining what this thing is on screen so that Hollywood or a fully Western audience is like, oh, okay, we get it. But now I'm bored because you've explained it all or something like that. So yeah, employ what we use.
Yeah. And to build on that, okay, you said it kind of thing, there is such a thing as overtelling too. When you are storytelling in film, it is possible to overtell to the point where you take the limelight away from your characters themselves and their role as agents in telling a particular story. And to continue off of what my friend in the back said, that idea of the oral storytelling too, if you include something like that, you're also developing context at the same time too. So again, you're killing multiple birds with one stone. You're able to develop a character. If your La Jablas is a character, you're also able to develop that Caribbean context of our modes of storytelling. And you're also able to evoke that idea that the Caribbean is made up of diasporic populations from places like Africa that have brought these storytelling traditions with them. Yeah? This is my favorite topic. So
Oh, fine then. Thoughts on adapting a Caribbean story, an existing Caribbean story?
So that is actually where my PhD started, right? It's not where it is anymore, but that's where it started. And I think originally what I started to look at, so I was actually looking at Jamaican novels like Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber, and you all know who Marlon James is, yeah. So I was originally looking at, I thought about doing 7 killings, and then I thought my death will be the 8th if I try to do a thesis on a book of this volume, yeah. Yeah, HBO is currently developing a screenplay on that as well. So I think with respect to adapting Caribbean narratives, especially within the Caribbean itself, there is definitely going to be its challenges, but it definitely has its positives too. Because one thing that is going to be fairly, I don't want to say simple, but it's going to be achievable rather, is capturing the aesthetic. Because you live in the aesthetic of the novels, right? When a place is described and all of these things, it's easy for you to evoke. Like, I remember a few years ago when I was tutoring for a poetry course. The poet of a particular poem was from Caroni. Mentions it nowhere in the whole poem, just kind of describes that environment, right? And at the end of the class, somebody says, that sounded like Caroni, you know. And it was. So again, this idea of the sign and the way that we represent things, that is what is going to make or break. And I think in terms of that auricularization of the story, the way that we speak is natural. You're not going to have to train an actor to speak like how we speak, or you're not going to get somebody whose accents or the way that they use particular dialects and vernaculars that is going to sound kind of like artificial, right? You don't have to worry about those aspects. But I think the biggest challenge in terms of like adaptation would be like for Caribbean novels that are like science fiction. Yeah. So that's what the Nalo Hopkinson Midnight Robber is. She envisions this kind of Afro-conscious, futuristic society, and she adopts these figures like Nanny of the Maroons, and Anansi is now the figure that is responsible for the web. You get it? Anansi, web, spider, yeah. And as well as his association with this knowledge and storytelling. Obviously, it makes a lot of connections like that. So then if we were to adapt something like that, therein lies a challenge. Because then you first have to make sure, like you're concerned about audience, I can't just reimagine it one time, right? Because then if you don't know the original story, it's getting lost in the reimagining too, right? So I think genres like that, like Caribbean, science fiction, and fantasy, especially where we reimagine existing historical and cultural things, I think that would be our biggest challenge film-wise. But I'm very optimistic, I think. We have a lot of potential, especially where existing narratives, like novels, and with adapting them, is concerned. Okay, so I think that's it for me today. And I hope you all enjoyed the session. I will make the slides available to all of you. And thank you all for being such an attentive audience, even though you didn't know my movie examples. But I'll live, you know?
All right. Thanks, Amanda, for that, very informative lecture. And thank you guys all for staying, and especially those of you online that went for the live stream. As we said, we would make these slides available as well as contact information for Ms. Zilla if you guys are interested. And also, she is doing her 3rd seminar for her PhD tomorrow. So if you guys want to hear exactly what her thesis and her research is about, that is available like on link on UWI Marketing. So we will also advertise that on our social media pages. So thank you guys so much for staying. This section is finished, the lecture, but we're going to move in now to the workshop aspect, where I did ask persons to come with story ideas and story concepts so that Ms. Zilla would help you guys workshop your idea from just a concept or just a general idea into an actual narrative and screenplay. This is very useful, very, very informative, so I do hope you guys stick around, and we will be doing that in the classroom. So thank you again. This is the 3rd workshop that we are having in our series, Filming TNT. We have one more going on next week, Thursday at 10 a.m. It is contracts laws, the lights, cameras, and contracts, dealing with contract law and the legalities of film. So please, 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 especially those of you who are students, attend, because it's normal and it's going to be interesting throughout your careers, where people are going to ask you to sign contracts, sign away your intellectual property, and you guys have to come and learn to understand how law and what protections you need and what you have before engaging into these different types of jobs and careers. So please do come. It is next week with another university lecturer, Dr. Justin Koop. So please do come. It will be next week, Thursday, right here at 10 a.m. So thank you guys and everyone streaming, and that's it.
I love this land too bad, boy. I believe in land. I believe in land.
Hi, I'm Michael Mulida, Director of Green Hills by the River and a graduate of UWI.Film Program. So check us out.